So it seems to me that if we can find real ivory chains that came from shamans in Alaska, we've kind of solved this long-standing murder mystery in which Father Juvenali was killed. He disappeared. No one really knew what happened. We had this bogus diary that just confused the issue for more than a century. And now we can say with some confidence we really know what happened to this last missionary monk. He was very successful. He got into the sunbeam, the way of seeing of those native people, enough to present Christianity in a way that was meaningful to them because they accepted his message, they were baptized, and they remained faithfully Orthodox and Christian to this day. I have a nephew who moved to this village, married a young woman from that village. They still live in Quinahawk in the same village. And he knew that I was interested in this story. So one of the last times I saw him at home in Cuixloc, in my wife's home village, he said, "You know, Father Michael, I heard that story finally. Someone from the village told me the story, and they told me the story the same way Grandpa used to tell it, except for one thing. They say that just before that monk," they didn't know his name, "just before that monk was killed with all those arrows, standing there in the front of the boat, it looked to those archers, those hunters on shore. At the last minute, it looked to them like this, whoever he was, this tall man in the beard and dark cassock, it looked to them like suddenly he was trying to chase away flies." We understand immediately what he was doing, right? Yeah. They had never seen anyone do that, and he was probably going rather fast. And here we are 200 years later, and the oral tradition among those people is that just before that man, whoever he was with the brass cross around his neck, it looked to them like he was trying to chase away flies. But he was dying a Christian martyr's death, to bless those who curse you, to pray for those who abuse you. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And they didn't know what they were doing. They were in their beam of light. He was in his, and he didn't have enough chance to explain to them. Now, and this other man, he jumped overboard and swam away. And there's no swimming tradition among this tribe. If he had been from that tribe, he could have shouted out loudly, "Hey, brothers, don't shoot, I'm a friend." Obviously, he couldn't do that because he didn't speak their language. He's from a different tribe, a different culture. So he tried to swim away, and that gives us a clue as to his identity. Because retracing Father Juvenali's route, I also was assigned to the village of Tyonek on the shores of Cook Inlet, the North Pacific Ocean, and I sat one evening with an elderly man in his late 80s, and I said to him, "Maxime," he's Orthodox, his patron saint is Maxim the Confessor. Next to a little icon of St. Maximus the Confessor, in fact, in his kitchen, I said to him, do you know any people around here who swim? He said, "Swim? I swim. I still swim. We live here on the shores of the ocean. We're beluga whale hunters. If we strike a whale and the whale begins to dive or swim away, we dive in after him." There's our swimmer. It means that in addition to Father Juvenali, perished his guide, his companion, his reader, who was an Athabascan Indian whose name is known only to God. He's our unknown soldier. But the last of the heroes of this chapter in our missionary history, those monks who came from Valam and who introduced Christianity, married the couples in the Aleutian Islands, preached the gospel, but I think most importantly, presented the gospel as the fulfillment of what the native Alaskans already knew, rather than denigrating and attacking and trying to destroy that cultural foundation, because they were wise enough to recognize that that was a spiritual foundation, a spiritual soil into which the gospel could be planted. Because you see, that's always the case. You have the seed, the truth, the gospel, the Orthodox faith, but it has to be planted into something. And if it falls on rock, it won't grow. And if it falls among thorns, it will be choked. And if it falls on the roadside, the birds of the air will swallow it up. But it falls into good soil, it bears fruit. Some 30, some 60, and some 90-fold. Now, how do you count for some of it 30 and some of it 60 and some of it 100? Soil conditions. Same seed produces a different harvest depending on the culture into which it entered. And if you have a spiritually receptive and active culture, it will produce much fruit. And if you have a culture that is brittle or hard or unreceptive, it'll be a lot harder to plant the seed. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try. But in this respect, in my own opinion, it was easier for the missionaries to walk across Siberia and bring Christ to those people who were spiritually attuned and receptive to it than it might be for us in our secular age. Nevertheless, what can we do to soften the soil, to kind of rake it and prepare it? I believe we have to challenge people to think of their own spiritual values, think of their own spiritual culture. The modern world is pretty much unspiritual or even anti-spiritual. So we need to get to talk about our grandparents. We need to talk about, it's the third definition of culture that I didn't have time for earlier, but I'll conclude with. Your culture is the way you see things. Your culture is the game of life as you play it. But most of all, your culture is the story into which you were born. And you're not chapter 1. You're chapter 3, minimum. Your grandparents are chapter 1. Your parents are chapter 2. You're chapter 3. Your kids become chapter 4. Your grandchildren become the 5th chapter. What will chapter 5 know about chapter 1? Only what chapter 3 tells them. Huh? They won't go to the library and find out. Hollywood will not produce the special. Huh? They won't get it on video games or DVDs. This story must be told. And that's how you learn your culture, by the example set by the adults around you and by the stories you are told. Those stories should be biblical stories. Children should be raised on the parables of our Lord. But there are also the stories that says, and you know, let me tell you about your grandfather. Your great-grandfather. I know one story about my great-grandfather. He was a blacksmith who was short, not quite 5 feet tall, thin and wiry, and used to get periodically launched out of his blacksmith shop by his customers who kicked him so hard that he went flying 30, 40 feet in the air, right out the doors and crash landing on his front porch. My mother reports as a little girl seeing her grandpa flying past and landing on the flagstone pavement, and she'd watch with horror as he crash landed there. But time and again, she says, she saw him dust himself off, grab his hammer, and charge back into that barn to finish the job. I asked my sister if she knew any other stories about that grandfather. She said nothing more than that. But Mom told you that story? Yes. I checked with my brother. He didn't know anything more, but he knew that story. When did my mother tell me or my sister and brother the story of the flying blacksmith? None of us could remember, but we had a hunch. There are those days when you come home frustrated and defeated from a football game, from a band practice, from whatever it was you begged to sign up for and you found out it wasn't so easy and you're not enjoying it as much as you expected. And you throw your instrument case or your gym bag down and you say, I quit. This is too hard. This is not fun. Or in our house, the worst you might have said was, I can't do this. Mom would say, come over here and sit down. And we got the blacksmith story again. You see what I mean about your culture? You don't get the ball game of life off the shelf from a rule book. You get the ball game of life from the stories people tell you and the patterns they themselves set as role models and examples. We might be living in a spiritually difficult time where the soil is hard and we try to plant the seed and it bounces back. Well, we've got to do some raking. We might have to do some cracking. But it seems to me the way to do that is to awaken in people the obvious need we all have to be human beings who know where we fit in the cosmic scheme of things. We're here according to God's will and God's plan. And that we each come from a unique history, and that history hasn't started with us. Our ancestors still have important lessons to teach us. The flying blacksmith being just one of many. Huh? You learn that you don't give up because you don't come from quitters. And you're the continuation of that blacksmith's line. And so you have a responsibility not to betray the story that began before you were born. And if we can get people to think in these terms, then when we read the anaphora, the story that is ours by baptism, that God created everyone and everything according to his plan, according to his purpose. He has brought all things from non-existence into being. And when we have fallen away, he did everything to raise us up again and endow us with his kingdom, which is to come. That becomes your story. But you've got to understand that everybody's born into a story. Now, if they're not ready for our story yet, to be endowed with the kingdom which is to come, we've got to at least have them think about the story they already should know. And this is my great concern now. I teach a college class in which students from all over Alaska and sometimes from around the world are given the assignment to tell me a grandpa or grandma story next week. The minority kids have no problem with this. The African Americans say, oh yeah, they want to tell you right now. They've got 5 stories from 4 different grandparents. The Hispanic kids, right now. The Vietnamese kids. You know, the suburban white kids come up to me rather sheepishly and say, when is this assignment due? Next week. I guess I better call home. Now here are kids soon to graduate from college, 22, 23 years old, and they know nothing about the story into which they were born. They know lots of other stories. They've been watching TV, 800 channels all their life. They take that for granted, that everyone has always watched television with 800 channels since Adam and Eve. They've never realized that people my age were born into houses that didn't have TV or radio or a telephone. If you go back another generation, or electricity, right? They don't know. So it's our job to, I believe, to rake the soil, to prepare it for the story we have to tell by awakening in our culture the need for everyone to know their own story. Let's start there. Because if you don't know your own story, you won't be able to appreciate someone else's. And therefore, I believe it's really part of our ground preparation, so to speak, to get people to talk with each other. It used to be called visiting. Do you remember those days? Huh? Are you old enough to remember when family visited families and they didn't come to watch the Super Bowl game? They turned the TV off because we have company now, and they sat around and served refreshments and they told stories and reminisced. You remember? It's a cultural thing. That's why I say we don't live in the same culture, my kids and myself. Because my kids consider a visit when their friend comes over and they play video games. And they don't even talk to each other the whole visit. And adults are almost as bad. We used to hear a lot of those old stories as the adults reminisced in the living room. And they'd hear us eavesdropping and say, this is none of your business, go play. But we wanted to know, huh? And that's how you understand the beam of light. That's how you come to see things in a certain way. And people in another culture are telling their own kids and their own stories, and they're getting to see theirs. And in the next culture, they're seeing theirs. And in a multicultural America, we have the chance to have ours and glance this one and this one and this one. And the more of those we get into and the more of those we see, the more human we're going to be. The more complete. And by the way, I believe Orthodoxy has the viewpoint of the guy on the roof. It's not just one sliver or another sliver or another. It's the whole picture. So we're the ones sitting on the roof saying, hey, you guys should come out of the barn. Come on up here. But they're not ready for that because they're not even looking through the roof. They're not telling those stories. They're not seeing things in any particular way. We're losing our cultural identities. It's one last point I would say. The monks came to Alaska to bring orthodoxy to the people they called the Americans. They never called them Native Alaskans. They never called them Eskimos, Indians, or Aleuts. They called them the Americans. But they realized that these Americans were different tribes who had different cultures, different languages, different artistic traditions. So in that respect, it's not so much different now. We know that there are Americans who are of all these different cultures and racial backgrounds. But they went to each one and they said, tell me your stories. And they presented Christianity as the fulfillment of all that was good and beautiful in those stories. Isn't that a good paradigm for us today? Huh? So many people, and it makes me quite ill, want to evangelize America by standing outside the gates and railing against it. You heathen, hedonistic, money-grubbing, secular, awful people. You can't save what you don't love. You can't save what you don't love. You got to embrace it, understand it, accept it, and then, as the monks did in Kodiak, then begin to teach it and to guide it. Because they will accept what they see as obviously better, deeper, wiser, and more beautiful than what they had before. But we got to get the conversation started. And I'm simply suggesting we should do exactly as the monks did 200 years ago. Let's listen to each other. Tell me your stories. Tell me something about your grandfather. Tell me something about your grandmother. Can we talk about this? And you know what we find out? We're not so different. Because I hear in your story something that overlaps with mine, and I hear in yours something that overlaps with mine. And I hear in yours everything so totally extraordinarily, it's totally different from mine, but I'm enriched by hearing it. So you can't lose, you see. But we need to talk about our own stories, get people to understand that Christianity is the fulfillment of that story, and ultimately the fulfillment of everybody's story. The worst thing we could have is enter a culture that had no story to tell. But before we lose it, before it's too late, I believe this is how we soften the soil for the planting of the gospel. To hear the stories, to accept all that's good, true, and beautiful in them, and to present our faith as the fulfillment of that. And if we do that, we'll succeed by the grace of God the same way those monks did in Alaska 200 years ago. Because we'll be doing what all Orthodox missionaries have always done, loving the people first, and then bringing them to salvation. Amen.